And so I guess then we can get going because we've got a pretty busy, large number of topics to cover. So I'll start off, Eric, maybe first, just introducing you. You're obviously the senior technology editor at JOC, and I'm sure most of our viewers will be familiar both with JOC and some of your writing. But if you could just sort of give us a bit of background on yourself and what you do, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, I'm, as you said, I write about logistics technology for the Journal of Commerce, or JSC.com. I've been in the B2B media space around the logistics industry since 2005, a few more years covering kind of ports and shipping and goods movement even before that. So I'm really, it's kind of scary to say I'm coming up on 2 decades now. That's why there's more gray hairs here. But yeah, the last 3.5 years with the Journal of Commerce, focusing really on a huge range of different technology categories that shippers, freight forwarders, ocean carriers, terminals, port authorities, and even on the domestic side, trucking companies and all the parties that they cater to, all the technology that they need to sort of understand and potentially invest into. So.
Perfect. And Julien, you're the co-founder and CEO of Wakeo. Sort of, how did you go about, just very briefly, I suppose, founding the company, and sort of what's the quick background of the company itself?
Yeah, sure. So Julien Cote, co-founder and CEO. I don't have 2 decades of experience in logistics like Eric, but still a bit of experience as well. So we created the company 5 years ago. Both co-founders, we come from a background at PwC, the consulting firm, working really on supply chain transformation for big corporations. So quite used to ERP, TMS deployments, and today will be a great topic for us to cover. The company itself, so we are operating in the visibility space, providing a SaaS technology to bring multimodal visibility. So here we are talking about ocean, but also air, road, and inland services. It's really how you can cover and bring much more reliability and anticipation on door-to-door services. So that's what we do at the Control Tower. And we operate today really for global customers in several industries, big names as shippers like Uniqlo in retail, Air Liquide in gas, Faurecia in automotive, and also freight forwarders like Jeffco, like Clestian. And we had an interesting article last year with Eric as well on the topic. So yeah, really helping those companies having more anticipation and agility. 2020 and the current period is quite intense and attractive for visibility, definitely. And very recently, last week, we announced a new fundraising on our side, reaching a total of $13 million with US and European investors. So yeah, really here to double down on our tech with more data scientists and keep going on the internationalization of the company.
Great. And I mean, you mentioned in there, Julien, the kind of intense period for supply chain and logistics. And obviously, Eric, the last sort of 18 to 24 months have been a pretty challenging period. And that's not breaking news for anyone who's watching this. They'll be well aware. How have you seen, have there been any changes in how technology is playing a part in the planning and management of supply chains?
Yeah, we're definitely not sure on any things in the media to report on these days. There's been such an explosion of interest in our industry, and I think there's mostly positives to that. We have a lot of people that maybe knew we existed but didn't care, or a lot more who didn't even know sort of supply chains and logistics were the reason that they got all of the things to their house and in such a convenient kind of fuss-free way. So I think the positive thing is there's a lot of attention on the industry in a way that's never been there before. So you asked about what's been, is technology helping cope with the challenges of this environment? So I say yes and no. and how's that for a diplomatic answer to start off with? Yes, in that demand for technology across supply chains, and that's both kind of in traditional logistics functions, but really also broader end-to-end supply chain has definitely grown. And so if I pick 5 technology providers that I talk to, whether I talk to them regularly or the first time, they all are telling a single story, the same sort of story, which is we are just seeing a huge amount of interest in our solutions. We're seeing huge growth. And that's, kind of pure standalone software providers, so SaaS providers, pure data providers, or sort of providers that straddle the line between data and applications. And then, of course, all of the tech-focused 3PLs, whether international or domestic, they're all seeing huge growth. So that tells one part of the story. I say no because if I speak to shippers and some of those forwarders who are sort of incumbent, or this is kind of I think a bad word for them, but legacy forwarders, it's not so straightforward, right? They're not investing, they're not tripling and quadrupling what they invest into technology that they did pre-pandemic. They're definitely more attuned to the need to invest long term, but a lot of them are, some of them are in, I won't say a lot, but some of them are in survival mode right now. A lot of them are in kind of constantly figuring things out mode. And, a lot of them are having to adapt to new kind of supplier relationships on one side and customer relationships on the other, mostly due to changing consumer preference. E-com is obviously a huge driver, but even that's bled into industrial settings. So I think big picture, tech is more on people's radar than it's ever been before. And this time is definitely a catalyst for sort of reconsidering how your planning and your transportation management structures are set. But I find it interesting that most of the tech providers are telling me massive growth, and maybe it is for them based on their baseline. But a lot of shippers are still in, I don't have time for massive digital transformation now. I want to use this time as a catalyst for that. But right now I'm just trying to, keep the engine running for another week. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally. Typically on our side, it's true we've had a very good traction. I mean, 300% growth over 2020 in a very, very troubled environment for international supply chains. But okay, that said, when you look at all the shippers and freight forwarders, it's true that they are in the middle of the storm. So it's always very hard to step back and take time to say, okay, what can be our long-term transformation? That's for sure. Just like looking at the plan for the next 3 to 5 years is kind of very a challenge. What is interesting though, is that we see a lot of top management from companies going to their supply chain teams and saying, okay, today we have crazy costs. I mean, multiplied by 4, by 8, and the service level is lower and lower. We're talking about 70, 80% of D-days, depending on the routes. So it's just like a crazy time. You have rising cost, very low service level. So supply chain is really at the center of a lot of strategic thoughts for companies, but still you need to navigate through these storms. So the operational teams are here to answer customer demands, to find some kind of last minute and emergency options. That's what they need to cope with. But yeah, we see those 2 levels. And that's, I think, an interesting point, the moment when we'll find a kind of balance where a company will be able to invest also in the future, because everyone more or less agrees on the fact that definitely they need to invest in the future. And when you see this kind of a very disruptive environment, they know they need to prepare in the future. If something similar to this at a different scale, most probably, but they need to be prepared next time, much more than they used to be in the past.
And so I guess on that note, it'd be interesting, Julien, to have a sort of deeper explanation of exactly how Wakeo goes about providing clients with a sort of more detailed and more accurate level of visibility across shipments. And
sure. So basically, we really focus on leveraging technology to help our customers navigate through the storm. So here we talk about anticipation, about being much more agile, which are some kind of keywords in supply chain environment. But I think what is really interesting with this crisis is that it shows it as a very, very concrete reality for teams. Because what we do as a technology today is we have a SaaS platform, so we cover all modes from ocean, air, road, rail also, really with a strong expertise on overseas, which is our original expertise from our background. We aggregate hundreds of data sources, so information coming from transport providers. Here we are talking about shipping lines, airlines, carriers, ports, and terminals. But we do not limit ourselves to declarative information. We also enrich it with independent sources. So we use ADSB and AIS data for sure, also IoT information coming from third-party providers. So we don't do any kind of hardware, but we do contextualize using web services or APIs, temperature, gas pressure typically. And here really the goal is to have some kind of global monitoring of the flows to quickly identify hotspots and how you can focus your added value actions on the top 10% or 20% of issues you're facing. So it goes beyond just having some kind of email alerts. It's really how you can have a strategic vision of your supply chain, how you can assess performance and really build some kind of continuous improvement approach, whether being on improving the on-time delivery, and that's really to improve customer experience on one side. And on the other side, obviously optimizing costs on one side from the transport cost perspective, but also from the inventory perspective, because we see with this crisis that inventory is a key part of supply chain and a key part definitely of the end-to-end supply chain planning. So it's really having a total cost approach. That's our DNA and what we do for our customers.
And then, Eric, you've sort of mentioned that a lot of the focus at the moment is on keeping the proverbial ship afloat during these very turbulent times. But do you occasionally sense then there's a lack of understanding of the important role that visibility can play in end-to-end supply chain planning? And then also similarly, do you think that there's a total awareness of what technology there is out there to help get that additional visibility?
Yeah, it's interesting you ask this because this is sort of like fundamentally what I sort of see my role in being in part. So I don't think there's so much a lack of understanding about the importance of visibility. I think it's fair to say maybe 10 years ago, there was a bit more lack of clarity about how valuable visibility actually was. I think there was a sense that it was valuable, but it was hard to make that sense concrete around a use case. I don't think that's the case anymore. There's still a confusing market, but it's, from a buyer perspective, it's gone from, proverbial kind of want to have to need to have. So now it's a much more sophisticated kind of buying process because you have to figure out exactly how you want to apply it. So, I'd say probably 1 out of every 2 conversations I have with shippers and forwarders revolves eventually, maybe not completely, but it revolves eventually around the topic of visibility. So it's on their minds for sure. Absolutely. I think I mentioned I've been covering this space for a while, and in one sense, not that much has changed from the buyer perspective. When they go to the market, they are more sort of educated now, and they are more sophisticated buyers, but they still tend to see gaps in modes or regions, or in the handoffs between modes. And the other thing now is because we're 15, 20 years into this period of visibility as a category, some of them have been burned by solutions that promised more than they delivered, right? So they have those sort of that scar tissue from a buyer perspective that didn't exist in previous generations. So when I look at the market, it still can be confusing because it's not a static market, right? It's not the same players that were there 10 years ago. You have a lot of new players. Some of the players that were name brands 10 years ago are now considered legacy and not very modern. And there's also a lot of different types of visibility providers, even if we sort of drill down into ones just around the freight kind of category. Visibility can be extrapolated into a bunch of different kind of types across B2B environments, but let's focus on freight transportation. And, there's standalone providers such as yourself. There's ones that are sort of purely transportation focused. There's ones that are focused on adjacent kind of value propositions. And everyone's kind of trying to vie for that all modes, all geographies, mantle. And yet every single company has a different starting point in terms of their technological structure too. So that's what makes it confusing from a buyer perspective. And I'll just add one other element maybe is logistics practitioners, the people who get the most value out of these tools, they aren't often always empowered to make buying decisions on technology in the way that, say, in finance or marketing maybe is. So, there's that. And some of it is internal, like logistics professionals tend to rightly think of their knowledge as sort of hugely additive from a value perspective. They have that experience. They know how things work. So it takes a bit of a mindset difference to be able to take your hands off the wheel and let the data, do the work for you. And then it takes the, leverage in your organization to be able to invest in that. So, I'd maybe wrap up my thoughts on this by saying, is this the year to be able to invest? That's another question, because we've talked about the chaos. Freight rates are sky high. As Julien said, lead times are longer, right? All of that translates into extra cost burden for the shipper, particularly. So the question is, can you make the case to invest in more technology with those additional costs? And it's sort of a chicken egg situation, because you can say we need to invest because of those costs, or I'm sure there's some organizations that are saying, no, we have too many costs right now to invest right at this moment. So it's obviously so different for every organization, but it's a very challenging market to buy into right now.
Yeah, but yeah, that's true. I mean, if you want to differentiate from your own competition, you need definitely to invest in technology in the future. But that's hard from a cost perspective, as that you say. And also change is a major barrier. I mean, from one company to the other, they have different cultures. But for sure, some people just thought in the past maybe technology was some kind of magic. Today we do have a very strong team of data scientists with algorithms and very reliable ETAs. That's for sure. But that won't be saying, okay, we will solve all your issues on your supply chain. And I mean, technology is kind of a layer that must be used by the on-top expertise. And I think really the vision we have typically at Wakeo is, okay, technology is here to empower people, not to replace them, but much more to say, okay, instead of focusing your time on getting the right information at the right moment, technology can provide you this information, and then you spend your time on decision making. Whereas the expertise is, I mean, you talked, Eric, about those experts, those freight forwarders. I mean, those people, they really know how they can organize a door-to-door flow, the right combination between warehousing, taking into account customs. And I think that's where the value is for them. And that technology can really help them, but it won't solve the whole chain. And also, there is some kind of IT landscapes they need to take into consideration. I mean, visibility is not on the whole chain. It's not today. Typically, we focus really on transport first, plus our core expertise is really on overseas. So with our tech, we have more than 95% of coverage on ocean market, on air market. But if you want to be everywhere, I mean, let's face it, supply chain logistics, that's 10% of global GDP. So you can't be everywhere. You need really to focus, and then to have APIs to be connecting to other tools, because obviously you are not looking to another tool, but really much more into an integrated IT architecture. And that's something that is hard. It takes time to get to the right level of maturity, and change is still here on the table and needs to be also taken into consideration.
Yeah, Edward, if I can just add on to that, I think what you said about both whether you're extracting data or providing data. I'm really very interested these days in technologies that are sort of minimally disruptive to existing IT architecture, because like I said, the logistics practitioner who benefits the most from some of these tools is oftentimes the one who's least able to drive a true digital transformation for his or her company. So if you can say, I want to invest in a subscription-based system that doesn't mess with my existing IT architecture at all, other than some integrations or an API that needs to be set up, that's a much easier sell than saying, no, I need an entire platform that's going to replace 3 other systems that I'm using right now. That's just really hard in any environment, but especially right now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, interoperability is key. And you said it. I mean, if you're a supply chain planner, for instance, potentially you're not even involved in the transport visibility project because it's led mostly by the transport team director, supply chain director, but maybe not supply chain planner. But still, I mean, using API is what is really interesting, and that's why we chose also this topic today, is that transport is a key part of the end-to-end supply chain, and we need to connect the dots to have those APIs to push back data directly into the ERP of the shipper, the TMS of a freight forwarder, so that it can be properly leveraged.
And so I guess so far we've kind of dealt somewhat in the theoretical of the impact that visibility can have. And I'm sure a lot of people out there will think perhaps this applies to them, but it's always interesting to get into these really tangible results. Julien, do you have any specific examples of clients that are using Wakeo throughout the end-to-end supply chain planning process? Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, transport is a key part of end-to-end supply chain. If we look at 2 main goals, visibility has a direct impact into those goals. I mean, on one side, if you look at the customer expectations and satisfaction, typically talking about a use case of a big US e-retailer, they are among the top 30 fastest growing e-retailers. They have more than 150 suppliers in Asia, a lot of trans-Pacific flows. And what is very, very sensitive for them is obviously transit time, because they're selling goods that are on the ocean, still on the containers. So when they deliver their customers, they face today, obviously, a lot of delays. So they had a lot of angry customers coming to them, a lot of waste of revenues as well. And what they did using visibility is reassessed the transit time, the new standard on the market, the new normal. And that's very key because they were able to adjust basically their customer promise so that they can have a much more reliable information to their customers. And at the end of the day, it's more customer satisfaction and it's also optimizing revenues. So that's one example typically in the e-commerce ecosystem. But you have in other industries some very interesting example as well. We work today with Vibron, which is a big German medical company, 7 billion euro revenues, and they are delivering critical goods to hospitals. So in the past, when you look at typically the ERP process, they had some standard lead time in their SAP. But then they used to update it every 2 to 3 years, which is not very often because they had no information on the actual transit times. So what changed using Wakeo was basically in the past, when they had 37 days of transit time from Europe to China, when they do exports, at the end of the day, a lot of times the total transit time was in fact 48 to 50 days. So more than 10 days of delay. So that's a lot, obviously, of customer dissatisfaction. And using these APIs and connecting the dots between transport visibility at Wakeo and the ERP SAP, they are able today to frequently and automatically adjust the transit time. So that's directly taken into account into the customer promise. And once again, it's much more customer satisfaction. And that's something super key, obviously, for the customers. And the second goal of the supply chain on the other side is obviously to maximize cost, also to serve the customers. And here visibility can help as well. With the crisis, obviously detention and demurrage has just like turned crazy. Today, that's a major topic for all shippers. And we have customers in the health industry. They used to negotiate a lot of free times just like up to 12, 14 days to be sure they will be just like in the right window. But when you do this, obviously you are buying this free time. And so using visibility, they said, okay, we know that actually we need only 8 to 9 days. So we can reduce our free time on one side. And that's already saving money. I mean, here we talked about 6-figure saving for them. And then you got into these supply chain disruptions. So today it's very, very hard on the D&D side. You have some ports in Brazil, in Australia as well, where the maximum free time is at 5 days. And so they need to know very well in advance which containers they need to prioritize, because time is money. And the sooner you can know that the container will be at the terminal, the sooner you can look at a solution to have it outside of the terminal. So yeah, it's really about anticipation. We improved more than 10% of the on-time delivery with Bibron typically. We reduced by 20% the emergency shipment of the big automotive company as well. So yeah, it's really working on the strategic goal of the supply chain.
Yeah, I think people will find that interesting and probably can see themselves in some of those challenges. I think in particular what's interesting to see about that is the sense that, and you kind of already, both of you had touched on it previously, where people might think of technology as this magical cure-all for all of the problems, and an acknowledgement here that visibility, having greater visibility won't necessarily, it's not a cure for the level of disruption that we're currently encountering, but rather just allowing you to raise some of the standards and just have a better sense of what's going on and handle that more efficiently. So then, Eric, when you look at then the current level of disruption that we are facing, which is perhaps unparalleled in terms of a 18 to 24 month period, do you think that means that there's an increased need for visibility, or can it be a sense from people because there's almost nothing you can do to get around the disruption, that the visibility might not help you as much as it would in a moment when you have alternatives and an ability to react to sort of less significant delays?
Yeah, well, I think about this a lot actually, because I obviously write and talk to visibility providers and technology providers in general, and think about, okay, well, how does the value of whatever they are developing, how does that change, or does it change in different sort of market conditions? So, to loop this back to what Julien just talked about, detention demurrage is a great example, right? Where you have this systemic issue that far predates the pandemic, right? I mean, this has been an issue. There were, in the US, for instance, there are hearings about this pretty contentious in 2018. And this is an ongoing situation that's been worsened as the pandemic has kind of clogged ports, or the demand boom that we're experiencing right now, especially in North America, has clogged ports. So that's an area where it feels like visibility can make a very specific difference in a chronic issue. As a provider of visibility, so I look at this particularly, maybe let's look at this through a forwarder lens, right? As a provider of visibility, that also needs to make buying decisions about what to invest in. I think they need to take a long-term view, because it's a tech procurement decision, but it's also the ongoing value prop that you provide to your clients. And if you're changing that value proposition every year based on the nature of your underlying relationship, I don't think that's ideal. I guess you could potentially frame that as you're being innovative and staying on the cutting edge, but it also looks like you're changing your providers every so often because you're not happy with the ones that you were using previously. So you really have to take a long-term decision, and you're putting a lot of trust into the provider you use, that they are going to be able to help you adapt across a range of market conditions, right? Because no conditions ever stay the same forever. For a shipper, you don't have the same consideration in terms of having to be a provider as well. But do you want to be in a position where you're more agile in terms of who you use, or do you want it to be a more consistent kind of arrangement? And so that really makes me think about, the nature of the relationship that you structure with your visibility provider. So, as to the value of whether this can, a provider can help you weather different scenarios. I personally think there's a sweet spot, particularly for visibility, where the market is not too settled and it's not overly chaotic. If it's too settled and things flow as you expect them to, the impetus to invest in this goes down a bit. Not entirely, but it goes down a bit. If it's too chaotic like it is right now, you might feel as though, yes, I know where my container is. I also know it's going to be stuck on the water outside LA Long Beach for 4 weeks, and then it's going to sit for a certain number of days in the terminal after it's unloaded. What can I do about that, right? So that middle area between those two states, which is honestly where the market is the vast majority of the time, I think there's tons of value, right? Because there are disruptions, but those disruptions are a lot more manageable. You feel like you can make contingency plans around those disruptions, and you use the technology to help you. Julien, you might disagree. You might say that there's value in very chaotic situations, and there's also value in very stable times. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I just think the value becomes that much more tangible in that middle area where there are disruptions, but they're not so severe that literally people feel like nothing can be done.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, visibility is not here to solve, once again, all the issues. I mean, there are some very extreme situations where basically the ship is at anchor. You have today 80 ships at Los Angeles, Long Beach. I mean, we can't fix it just using like a control tower. That's for sure. But if you look at the bigger picture, obviously the market is all the time evolving. I mean, there are changes in services. There are also a lot of disruptions because obviously with COVID it's super easy to understand. But even before, when we talked about Brexit here in Europe, when you talk about China-US trade war, just like reorganizing the services and the kind of balance you can have. Also, all those natural disasters, they're recently in Hong Kong and China. So typically it shows all those issues you have, you need a way to mitigate risk and to navigate through those uncertainties. And that's where visibility brings value. And that's really, for me, a long-term partner in how the company will empower itself through technology to manage risk and also to deliver a better customer experience. Because, I mean, we definitely need, for a lot of companies, to transform the model from going to look and reconcile the information towards really more decision-making. And that's what you mentioned, talking about typically freight forwarders that needs to rethink as well the value prop they're bringing to their own customers, because it's a whole transformation. It's not only kind of bringing an ETA to the shipper. That's, I mean, the wow effect of having a map and a blue paint point, and that's cool. But what really is interesting for a freight forwarder leveraging visibility is how all the operational teams can leverage it to provide a better service quality, because they are able to anticipate much earlier and to make smarter decisions based on large data sets. So that's what we see as a strong differentiator. So
I might add one other element to this, which is I had a shipper tell me a few years ago a very interesting thing. I think I'm going to paraphrase it because I obviously don't remember exactly what they said, but it was something to the effect of, if every one of my carriers performed in real life as they said they were going to perform, I would not need a visibility tool, right? Like that's the crux of the issue here. I think that was true, but at some point along the lines, the external dynamics that are even out of the control of the carriers themselves, whether we're talking ocean, air, trucking, those have gotten so powerful and so frequent that even if the carriers were adhering from a service perspective to what they committed to, those external dynamics external to both the shipper, the carrier, and the forwarder now are so prevalent that you still need something else, right? It's not just a matter of, an ocean carrier is only on time 60% of the time because they just didn't maybe place the importance on maintaining schedule reliability as they did before. Now it's, I as a carrier arrived at a port exactly as I thought I would, but I'm waiting for 4 weeks, or the terminal is shut down as I'm sailing toward it because of a COVID outbreak, right? So those are things that affect the shipper's ability to get their goods that are totally out of the control of every party in the chain, right? So that's where this is. I think the motivation to invest in this has changed a lot from just it was a lot more about managing service that was maybe not bad but below expectations, and now it's that, as well as there's just so many disruptions that are kind of working their way into big global supply chains that it's out of the hands of even every single provider or every single entity in the chain.
Yeah. And I mean, you're right saying that I see a lot of value in visibility being a trusted third party, because obviously between the shipper, the freight forwarders and carriers, a lot of things happen. I mean, we see how crazy the market is. Sometimes you're late for a good reason, sometimes for a bad reason. But from a shipper perspective, it's always very hard to understand what happened. Because when the freight forwarder is going to come to you for a business review, obviously they will say, okay, we did our best, and that's not our fault. And I mean, I totally respect that. There are different things on interest. But what the shipper needs to do is really understand what is exactly a market parameter, and you can't do anything, but you can still think how you can re-engineer your flows typically, but also understand really the performance and how you can drive some kind of continuous improvement. It's really a mindset of saying, okay, we accept this was good and this was not, but how can we really improve it working together? And I think it serves really the long-term relationships of the transport providers together with the shippers. But yeah, it's really a whole mindset and continuous improvement approach. But typically, a big automotive company we work for, they used to have a kind of a low performance on a specific road from China to Portugal, typically, because they had very, very cheap service. And I mean, from a cost perspective, that can be good. But they needed more than 60 days to go from China to Portugal, because they went up to Rotterdam. They waited for 8 to 10 days of transshipment and then down to Portugal. And sometimes you look at this kind of purchasing initiative and it kills reliability and performance. And when you look at the total cost perspective, you just lose 20 days of transit time in the example I'm giving you, because they were able to reduce it going through Barcelona and then by truck. So it's much shorter. The cost is a bit higher, but when you look at the total cost perspective, taking into account the inventories, it's just like much more reliable and much more interesting. So that's also the mindset on both sides, freight forwarders and carriers, but also for the shippers to say, okay, we're not thinking alone about transportation cost, but really the total cost approach. And here you need to involve finance as well, because if it's only an incentive on the purchaser P&L, it will be limited at the end of the day.
And I guess this is a good moment just to mention, if you do have any questions, you can use the chat to ask them. If you're feeling shy, you can actually just DM me and not have the question be in the public forum. But actually, we have one question that I think ties in. We'll get to the full Q&A in a bit, but ties in directly to what you've just said. It's a little bit of a cynical question, but does it play into anyone's interest to not have in true visibility become an industry standard, if you see what I mean? Is it simply in the interest of underperforming freight forwarders and logistics service providers, or is there does it benefit a larger group?
I can take a crack. So I want to separate out whether sort of visibility milestones across modes are standardized, and whether not having a single type of, or I guess having it standardized benefits a particular party. I think it's fair to say historically that certain parties, a lot of times intermediaries, have benefited from a certain amount of opacity in the market, right? Like you're able to carve out a margin when your buy rate on whatever, whether it's space on a vessel or, you know, what it costs you to kind of manage a shipment, is not necessarily visible to who you're selling it to, right? That's just common sense, right? So the lack of visibility, or the ability for an intermediary potentially to control what is visible, certainly historically has been there, and I think has benefited them. But, you know, I think 3PLs in general have embraced the need for visibility as much as anybody, and they're hearing demand from their customer, and so a lot of that has kind of gone out the window. And now, as Julien said, it's much more about, it's not about, hey, can I hide how poorly this shipment is performing relative to expectations, and it's much more about how much in advance can I tell you when this thing that's going to potentially go wrong is going to go wrong. That's where the value is. Not, well, I told you it was 30, now it's going to be 40 days, but trust me, we'll figure this out. It's more, hey, 20 days in, it's going to be 40 days, not 30 days. Let's figure out what to do about it. So I think that whole value proposition has changed. And if you are benefiting from opacity, I won't say your days are numbered because it's such a fragmented industry, but you're really going to have an uphill challenge against companies that are not providing value based on opacity.
Yes, you can live in a niche for a while, but that's a short-term and opportunistic strategy. If you look really at the global company strategy, if freight forwarders want to be here in the future as really industry leaders, you need to think about the long term and how you can really help your customers improve transport performance and anticipation, because sometimes some events happened and that's just life, and you need just like to help your customer anticipate, because they will have some consequences sometimes with their own customers. So that's really helping customers that they will bring more value to the table. And I think that, yeah, short-term strategy, just like hiding some kind of a cost or whatever, is not the future, definitely not. So we see a lot of pressure from the market, both from shippers asking it a lot to their freight forwarders, obviously, but also from new digital entrants. I mean, with a lot of funding sometimes, and that sets some kind of new standard on the market, and everyone needs to be here investing in visibility if they want to compete.
I mean, some of these entities have established margins, right? So the margin is transparent, right? It's not even a negotiation. It's, hey, we are taking X% margin. We will make it work. You have total visibility into the margin. Now let's just talk about our service for you, you know? So you're right. It's not going to change overnight, but over time, it will definitely change expectations. So.
Yeah, and that's the sense of a history, more or less. It's much more transparency and how you can bring some kind of a long-term value, because helping your customers is how you best evolve also over time. Because we know when you look at the economic times, just like the cycle are shorter and shorter. So you need to reinvent yourself faster and faster every day. And that's the way to do it. Really.
And then I guess there we're speaking about what's to come and the future and adapting. And I guess the last 18 to 24 months have shown us that trying to predict the future is maybe something of a fool's errand. But Eric, when you do look towards the next couple of years, which technologies or aspects of visibility in particular do you think are being underused when it comes to supply chain planning and management?
So, I mean, since we're talking visibility today, I have lots of conversations about this topic. So let's kind of explore that. As Julien said, the predictive ETA is now, I don't think that's sort of some ambitious state now. That's becoming expectation. So there's lots of emerging use cases for visibility beyond that. And some of it is in play right now. Things like risk management strategies, right? Is the data feeding into risk management, not just on a shipment by shipment basis, but on a more strategic basis. Where do I source from long term? Which partners do I use long term? And then inventory management. Julien again talked about that. Like the freight costs might be slightly higher, but if you can reduce your inventory carrying costs by the same amount or even more, then obviously that makes sense in a way that wouldn't have necessarily been apparent if you weren't able to tether, your predictive ETAs to what inventory you have en route or in storage, right? So those are things I think that are right now, here and now. More in the future, emissions calculations. I'm seeing so much interest in this. There's lots of different companies that are trying to tether visibility to insurance and trade finance products. So using the location and condition and predictive arrival of a shipment, whether it's an entire container or some subset of it, to reduce, kind of the risk or exposure from a insurance or financing perspective, opens up tons of windows. I mean, I think a lot of people see the potential value in those areas. Insurance and finance, I think, dwarf what we pay for freight rates historically, right? So if you open up those two windows, the opportunity is probably more than we even realize. And I think that's why you're seeing so much money, literally hundreds of millions of dollars and tons of M&A activity flowing into the visibility space right now.
And to elaborate on this, that's true that we also saw a very strong traction for environmental emissions tracking. Typically, I mean, there is a major wave at the consumer level, but today it has a direct impact in the B2B world as well. I mean, if you want to assess the article environmental impact, you need to take into account the whole chain. And so that's driving, obviously, the supply chain here. We had a lot of demands from our customers. They want to bring much more reliability, because today, when you look at emissions tracking, it's kind of still of a black box. So 10% of global emissions coming from here, from transport, but you have 3/4 of the transport providers not even giving an indicator. So that's kind of a total black box. And we released a new product early this year in Q1. So to help our customers on this, it's very in the line of our historical product, because it's still on tracking. And what is interesting here is that we have obviously all shipments and all modes as our historical product, but we are really able, as a key differentiator, to have all the data structured in our system, meaning we take into account any kind of transshipment, all the precise leg of transport to be much closer to the actual route, and also the weight of the goods. So a lot of factors like the CO2, like the sulfur, that we are able to factor to have a much more reliable approach on CO2 emissions, but also the gas. And our vision is that, being very pragmatic, I mean, we don't see customers driving their whole supply chain only on environmental impact. That's not for sure. But what they do is that it's becoming one of the key factors, like reliability of the service for sure, like price, definitely. And that's one of the factors of their decision making. And that's where they want to go. I mean, take more and more factors and parameters like these to make smarter decisions based on large data sets.
Yeah, it's I on the environmental thing, this is certainly something we're seeing a lot. We're hearing shippers starting to develop carbon budgets that sit alongside their transportation spend. I'm only allowed to emit so many units, or I have to start, adjusting my patterns or the providers I use if they're using, cleaner conveyances. And I, Julien, you mentioned the consumer imperative. I think there's two other imperatives. In some regions or some countries, there's regulatory mandates. There's also something that doesn't get talked about a lot, but a lot of private equity groups have put a pressure on their companies that they've invested in to start really getting a lot stronger on this. And whatever their motivation, whether it's, they actually care about it or not, those mandates are really happening. And so you're getting this sort of three forms of pressure on shippers, especially, to figure this out. And they are going to then in turn lean on their service providers to help them figure it out. So
yeah, it's no longer only listed companies. It's true also, you're right, from private equities. I think the vision is here that the long-term profit is higher if you have really a sustainability approach together with the economic approach. I mean, they're being very pragmatic. They are not just like doing philanthropy here. But I mean, being pragmatic, I think that's what is interesting. I mean, getting to a measure of emissions is the first step to much more transparency. And that's how you can build some kind of proactive strategy. Because if you're just like managing with a total black box, you can't do anything to optimize. So that's a step-by-step approach. It will take time, but I think we are heading into the right direction here.
And I guess there, just before we move on to the Q&A, Julien, obviously you've touched on there the emissions tracking as a relatively new development for Wakeo. Is there anything else that Wakeo has planned in terms of helping customers to improve their supply chain management and planning?
So yeah, we are really going into our vision of an augmented supply chain, as we call it. So what we see is a lot of decision makers taking into account one or two factors or three factors from their direct environment. Sometimes they know someone at the port or whatever. What we want to do is really to empower supply chain decision makers by taking into account more and more criteria. So emissions tracking definitely is one, like cost, service reliability, as I said. But tomorrow also there's kind of any kind of social movement, any kind of news events, a fire recently on a ship. I mean, we want to factor all of this to help decision makers. We're not going into some kind of automatic supply chain vision. We much think here about how we can recommend some options to our customers to help them. And at the end of the day, they are the experts. But we do believe that technology can really empower them to have smarter decisions.
Well, on that note, I guess we can move on to the Q&A. We've had a couple of questions come in. This is one that I guess sort of either one of you, well, you'll both probably have some sort of answer to, but we have one question which is speaking specifically about the fact that one of the major problems facing forwarders and logistics at the moment are the challenges dealing with customs processes all over the world. How do you think that visibility specifically can help to address that issue?
Julien, I'll let you take first.
Sure. So customs is definitely a key node in the door-to-door transport flows. So is that something to be taken into account as well? And that's something that we integrate in our tracking. It's complex from one country to the other because we still need to have more APIs, more maturity on the IT system side, but also, I mean, a broader access to data. There are some interesting initiatives today when you look at the ports of Singapore, Rotterdam, Antwerp, to name a few of them. But yeah, there's still a whole maturity on the chain to be improved. And that's it will take time here also, but definitely customs is a key node. It can increase for sure the global transit time, and that's something to put under control.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And Julien spoke about some of the limitations right now. A lot of times your visibility into whether, for instance, a shipment is going to be held up at customs is the predictive nature of that is very minimal at this point, because every customs agency is a little bit different. The database and targeting systems that they use are all tend to be different, and they don't provide a lot or any insight into what is likely to be targeted. So you have things like green lane initiatives where, you know, a known shipper moving a regular or routine shipment through from one origin to the next, you know, all their suppliers have been pre-vetted by the two agencies responsible on the export and import side. You sometimes have green lane initiatives. I don't know is there a green lane in some of the ports that are congested right now? I don't know. Like it's very difficult to coordinate and get data from such a dispersed set of systems that aren't necessarily designed to be, you know, kind of open source, right? So this is a massive challenge, and I don't know if it's solvable, you know, necessarily in the next year or so, right? This is a long-term issue
that's a long-term journey. That's something we already do today with some of our big customers. They connect us with their custom authorities. And so we connect the dots and basically expand our network. So we'll keep moving into expanding more and more our network to this kind of global coverage. But yeah, customs today is a complex part of the process, and it will still be, so it will take time.
And then I guess this is a question more specifically for you, Julien, but this is about who pays for what regarding the information that is sent and received by the platform.
We have different use cases. So we work both for shippers like Uniqlo, like Air Liquide or Vibra, and also for freight forwarders. So obviously the angle is different, and our customers is the one paying here to improve. If you are a freight forwarder, it's really to improve the customer experience you can bring. So they want to cover all their shipments on all modes to be able to transform their own model, to have their operational teams focus much more on decision making rather than getting access to this information. And yeah, in this case, they are investing for a better quality of service and a better information to their own customers. Sometimes we are on an API basis directly into their customer portal, and sometimes we are also embedded into their customer portal because they want to use our front end. So that's one use case, working with freight forwarders. The other use case is obviously working with shippers when we aggregate all the freight forwarders and carriers. And here the shippers is the one investing. Okay,
well, I think we've got about 2 minutes left, and I'm aware that there would be a certain degree of irony if we were to have a webinar where we speak about visibility and tracking and then ran over time. So with that in mind, it's probably a good opportunity to wrap up. And so, Eric, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. It's been a really interesting conversation to sort of be a part of, but mostly observe.
Thank you so much, Edward and Julien. Really enjoyed the conversation, and very interested to see where this industry goes in the future, because there's so much exciting stuff happening. So thank you.
Yeah, it might be better to have you on in the future when it's a little bit less disruptive, and maybe we have a clearer vision of what exactly is going on.
Definitely.
Yeah, and thanks, Eric, a lot for bringing your insights and expertise. Very interesting view on the market and where it goes. You have experience from the past as well, so see how the predictions from the past have evolved over time. We'll see in a couple of years what it looks like.